Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
They said therapy was too expensive. Then bought my brother a $70,000 sports car for getting back on his feet after his third failed relationship. And now they have the audacity to leave voicemails that start with, "We don't understand why you're acting this way, Rachel. What did we do wrong?" Funny. Because when I was 17, sobbing in the downstairs bathroom, trying not to pass out from the tightness in my chest and the absolute certainty that something inside me was broken beyond repair, they didn't ask that question. They told me I needed to toughen up, that I was making a scene, that I was probably just tired and needed more water. My mother even accused me of being dramatic on purpose to ruin her day, and my dad, he sat at the kitchen table, swirling ice in his glass like it was the only thing that mattered in the world, and said in his usual tone, the one that carried more judgment than concern, "You're not depressed, Rachel. You're just lazy." I guess it's easier to call someone lazy than admit you don't know how to help them. And it's a hell of a lot cheaper. Back then, I thought every family worked like this. That maybe I was being unreasonable. I mean, we had a nice house. We took summer vacations to Myrtle Beach, and there was always food on the table. The bills were paid, the heat worked in the winter, and there was a half-decorated Christmas tree in the living room every year whether we liked it or not. From the outside, we were fine, stable, even. But inside? The air in that house was so tense it could cut you. You learned to keep your head down and your mouth shut. You learned that crying made things worse, and asking for help was seen as a threat, not a plea. You learned that being okay was just code for being quiet enough not to cause problems. My brother, Tyler, was 5 years younger and somehow lived in an entirely different version of that house. He could throw tantrums, skip school, punch holes in his bedroom wall, and still come downstairs to a plate of pancakes and a kiss on the forehead. When he failed math, my parents blamed the teacher. When I got a B, they wanted to know what happened. When Tyler forgot his backpack, Mom drove it across town and dropped it off with a smile. When I forgot mine, I got a lecture about responsibility and how maybe I wasn't cut out for college after all. It wasn't even subtle. It was loud and constant and suffocating. But nothing made it clearer than what happened the spring of my junior year. I'd been struggling for months, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't eat without feeling like I might throw up. I was working 2 part-time jobs, trying to save money for college because I knew better than to count on their help, and I was still managing to keep my grades above average. But every night, it felt like something was sitting on my chest. I didn't have a name for it back then. I didn't know that what I was feeling was anxiety, that the panic attacks weren't me being dramatic, and that depression wasn't just some poetic word sad people used when they didn't want to deal with life. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one night, hands shaking so badly I spilled orange juice down my shirt, and finally blurting it out. "I think I need to talk to someone. A therapist, maybe." There was a pause. Just silence. Then my dad, without looking up from the newspaper, said, "Therapy's for people who don't have real problems." My mom added, "We're not paying for you to sit around talking about your feelings. That's not what we do in this family." And, just like that, the door slammed shut. Not physically, no one moved. But it slammed all the same. I felt it. The finality of it. The humiliation. What broke me, though, wasn't the rejection. It was what happened 3 weeks later. Tyler, who had recently turned 16, was driving home from his girlfriend's house when he backed into a mailbox and crunched the side of his car, a used Honda my parents had gifted him because he needed freedom to grow. He wasn't hurt. Neither was the mailbox, really. But you'd think he'd crashed through a goddamn wall the way my parents reacted. My mom sobbed like he'd been in a rollover accident. My dad shook his head in disbelief, said something about how boys need structure, and the next thing I knew, they were signing the paperwork on a newer, better car, one with leather seats, Bluetooth, and custom rims. It was his do-over, they said. I watched through the living room window as he peeled out of the driveway, blasting music like he'd just won the lottery. I don't think he even knew what happened the night I asked for help. He never had to ask. He just existed, and everything came to him. That night, I locked my bedroom door, turned off the lights, and cried until my throat was raw. And even then, I didn't make a sound. Because in that house, silence was safer than honesty. Years later, I still remember that silence. Not just the moment, but the weight of it, how it settled into my bones and convinced me that my pain wasn't real unless it came with bruises or blood or something dramatic enough to be inconvenient for someone else. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if they'd just said yes. If they'd let me go to one session. If they'd seen me, really seen me, instead of dismissing everything I felt as a phase or a manipulation or a lack of gratitude. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe I would have called them last Christmas. Maybe I would have picked up the phone last month when they texted me 5 times in a row asking if I was still mad. But back then, the only thing I learned was this: if you're not bleeding, they won't believe you. And even if you are, they'll find a way to blame you for it. Let me ask you something and be honest with me. Have you ever had someone look you in the face while you were breaking down and tell you it was all in your head? Have you ever begged for help and gotten a lecture instead? Because I can't be the only one who walked out of a childhood like that, only to spend the rest of their life pretending it never happened. And yet, it did. And that wasn't even the worst of it. There's something strange about the way a house that once held your entire life can begin to feel like a cage the moment you realize your survival depends on playing a version of yourself that isn't quite real. I left home at 18, but the truth is, I started packing my bags years earlier. Not clothes or books or anything physical, but pieces of myself I couldn't afford to show them anymore. By the time I got into a state college 2 states over, I was already emotionally gone, already living in the distant version of my future where I didn't have to listen to my mother sigh loudly every time I voiced an opinion or my father call me moody. Because I didn't laugh at Tyler's jokes, which, to be fair, were never funny, unless you find punchlines about fat girls and dumb blondes hilarious. When I left, I didn't cry. I didn't hug anyone. I climbed into a second-hand Toyota I'd bought with the tip money I earned bussing tables all through high school, and I didn't look back. Not because I was brave, but because I was afraid that if I did, I'd lose my nerve. I was terrified that if I let myself feel anything, sadness, guilt, hope, I'd break down in the driveway and end up staying. And staying meant more silence, more dismissals, more pretending to be grateful for crumbs while Tyler got the whole damn cake. College was hard, not because of the academics, which I could handle, but because I had to unlearn the idea that taking care of yourself was selfish. I had to fight the instinct to apologize every time I needed something: help, space, rest, food. I remember standing in line at the campus clinic for over an hour, stomach twisted in knots, trying to work up the courage to ask about counseling, and even then, my first question to the receptionist wasn't, "How do I sign up?" It was, "Is it free?" Because I'd been taught over and over, in ways both loud and quiet, that money spent on my needs was money wasted. Of course, I couldn't let them know. I didn't dare mention therapy in our weekly check-in calls, which always followed the same script. How are classes? Are you meeting people? Have you thought about switching majors? They didn't ask if I was happy. They didn't ask if I was sleeping or eating or surviving. They wanted bullet points, evidence that I was performing well enough to keep up the family image. When I finally told them I was working a 3rd job to afford groceries, my dad actually laughed and said, "That's the real world, kiddo, better get used to it," and then launched into a story about how he worked full-time while attending night school, conveniently forgetting that his parents paid his rent and tuition the entire time. Meanwhile, Tyler, who had decided, on a whim, that college wasn't for him, dropped out in his 2nd semester and moved back home, where he lounged around in sweatpants and smoked weed in the basement while my mother defended him at every turn. "He's just figuring things out," she'd say, as if he were a lost child and not a 20-year-old man who hadn't worked a day in his life. My father, for all his tough talk, barely said a word to him, and when I asked about it, I got the usual response: "We're handling it." What that meant was they were enabling it. They gave him money for gas, let him use their credit card for emergencies, and when his latest girlfriend dumped him, apparently for cheating on her with her roommate, they consoled him like he'd been left at the altar. It was absurd. I'd be lying awake in my dorm room, wondering if I could stretch a packet of ramen and half a granola bar into a meal, while Tyler was posting Instagram photos from some overpriced bar, holding a cocktail I couldn't even pronounce. paid for by the same parents who once told me that fast food was a luxury and people like us don't waste money on therapy. The turning point came junior year, when I finally scraped together enough savings to see a therapist outside of campus health services, someone neutral, professional, and not overbooked with anxious students on waitlists that stretched into the next semester. I used a fake last name and paid cash under the table because I was terrified my parents would somehow find out and shame me for being weak. That first session didn't fix everything, of course it didn't, but it gave me a name for what I'd been living with: high-functioning anxiety, complex trauma, emotional neglect. That's what the therapist said. Not laziness. Not drama. Not being ungrateful. Real words. Real problems. A real human response. Every time I went back home after that, for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, for birthdays, I noticed the cracks more clearly. The performative hugs. The careful conversations. The thinly veiled comparisons. My mother once told me I seemed cold lately, like the absence of my people-pleasing smile was a personal attack. Tyler, who now fancied himself a life coach despite never holding down a job for more than 3 months, cornered me in the living room one night after dinner and asked, with genuine confusion, "Why are you always so tense around Mom? She's just trying to help." I didn't answer, because what would be the point? Then came Thanksgiving, the last one I would ever attend. Tyler brought a new girl home, some wide-eyed 22-year-old who laughed at his jokes and called my mother Mrs. Harper like it was an honor. Dinner was loud, as always, and fake, as always, until somewhere between the stuffing and the pie, Tyler got into an argument with his girlfriend over something idiotic, raised his voice, and slammed his fist against the wall, hard enough to leave a crack in the drywall. My mother burst into tears. My dad stood up and barked at the poor girl to leave. And Tyler? He just sat there, breathing hard, like he was the victim in the whole thing. They cleaned up the mess. They made excuses. They didn't say a single harsh word to him. After dinner, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the cracked wall, and asked my mother, point blank, "What would you have done if I had done that?" She didn't answer. She just poured herself a glass of wine and walked away. And that silence, the exact same silence I'd lived with my whole life, told me everything I needed to know. 3 days later, I got a call from a friend back home who worked at the bank where my parents held an account. She didn't share details, legally she couldn't, but she said, with hesitation, "I just thought you should know. They transferred $10,000 into a new account in Tyler's name. Something about helping him recover from the stress of the breakup." $10,000. For him. To recover. From a breakup. I couldn't stop laughing. I laughed so hard I cried. And then the laughter stopped. Because I realized the joke was on me. There's a moment in every adult child's life, at least, the ones who come from families like mine, where you stop hoping that someday they'll apologize and instead, you start preparing for the day they accuse you of being cruel. It always comes wrapped in guilt-soaked language, like a casserole you didn't ask for. "We did our best." You're making a big deal out of nothing. You act like we abused you or something. And of course, the crown jewel of emotional manipulation, you're so ungrateful. As if wanting to be heard, understood, and treated with a fraction of the empathy they handed Tyler on a silver platter was some kind of personal betrayal. That phrase, "you're so ungrateful," would be the soundtrack of my 30s, echoing in my mind like a song you hate but know by heart, and it would all crescendo on the day my parents handed Tyler the keys to a brand new, gleaming red sports car. The same week they mocked me for buying a used sedan. By the time I hit 34, I had built a life that didn't depend on them, not emotionally, not financially, and certainly not for approval. I had a solid job in healthcare administration, not glamorous, but stable, an apartment I paid for on my own, and a car that, while not sexy by any stretch of the imagination, got me from A to B without issue. It had dents, sure, and the air conditioning only worked when it felt like it, but it was mine. I bought it outright, used, from a guy named Steve who showed me how to check the oil before I drove it off the lot. I remember calling my mom, not because I expected praise, but because, for once, I thought she might say something kind, something that resembled pride. Instead, her first words were, "You paid for that," followed by a sharp laugh and a comment about how it looked like something a mailman would drive. That conversation stuck with me, not because it hurt. I had long stopped being surprised by her capacity for casual cruelty, but because of what happened just 5 days later. Tyler had just turned 30, and even though he was still bouncing between jobs and couch surfing with a rotating cast of girlfriends, my parents decided, apparently without irony, that he deserved something special for reaching a milestone. So they bought him a car. Not just any car either. A cherry red convertible, brand new, with the kind of interior that smells like money and privilege and every chance I was never given. I found out about the car the way people like me usually find out things in dysfunctional families, through a photo texted to the family group chat I was too tired to leave. The picture was of Tyler, grinning like he'd won the lottery, leaning against the driver's side door with his thumbs up. The caption from my mother read, "So proud of our boy, happy birthday, sweetheart." The message landed with the weight of a sledgehammer, even though I should have seen it coming. I stared at that image for a long time, not because I was jealous, but because I was stunned by how easy it was for them to show joy, excitement, generosity, all the things I'd only seen them express when it came to him. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't come out like rage or sarcasm, and, honestly, neither of those things had ever done me any good in that house. A week later, I visited for Sunday dinner, the last one I'd attend willingly. The moment I walked in, I felt it. The same heavy tension that had haunted that house since I was a teenager, the subtle sense that I was on trial for something I hadn't done. Tyler was already there, of course, basking in attention, holding court at the dining table with stories about a business idea he had that was clearly just a pyramid scheme with a new name. My parents hung on his every word like he was unveiling the cure for cancer. At one point, he mentioned that he might move to Florida, just for a change of pace, and my father offered to help with the deposit, no questions asked. I watched the scene unfold with the quiet detachment of someone who has finally accepted that they are an outsider in their own family. After dinner, as we cleared the plates, my mother cornered me in the kitchen, her voice pitched with that artificial sweetness she used whenever she was about to say something deeply insulting. "You know," she said, "Tyler's just had a rough few years. We thought the car might give him a boost." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She went on, casually, "And you've always been so independent. You never needed that kind of help." That was it. That was the narrative. Not that I had been denied help, but that I hadn't needed it. As if survival under duress was proof of my strength and therefore justification for their neglect. As if my silence had been interpreted as consent, and my lack of crisis meant I didn't deserve comfort. I turned to her, then, and asked, with no emotion, "Do you even hear yourself?" She flinched, just a little, and then doubled down. "I don't know why you're always so angry. We've done everything for you. You act like we owe you something." That was when my father joined in, drawing a plate, tone flat and weary. "You've always been distant, Rachel. Maybe try being a part of the family for once, instead of criticizing everything we do." It was surreal, really standing in that kitchen. The same one where I had once stood shaking, 17 years old, begging for therapy while they told me I was making it up, now being told, as an adult, that the real problem was my attitude. That the issue wasn't the years of emotional neglect or blatant favoritism, or the fact that they had turned their son into a spoiled, self-absorbed man-child while treating me like an inconvenience. No, the problem was me, my tone, my coldness, my refusal to play along. But I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even roll my eyes. I dried my hands, set the towel down on the counter, and said something I had never said before, something I hadn't let myself believe until that moment. "I don't think we're the same kind of people." My mother blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, calmly, "that I'm done pretending any of this makes sense." And I left. Not dramatically. Not with slammed doors or shouted insults. Just left. But I wasn't just walking out of the kitchen. I was walking out of the performance. Out of the lifelong habit of trying to earn their love. Out of the toxic script I had been cast in since birth. They didn't know it yet, but that was the last time I would give them the benefit of the doubt. because I had finally realized that their love had conditions, and I wasn't going to meet them anymore. There's a certain type of revenge that doesn't come wrapped in shouting matches, ultimatums, or grand confrontations. It arrives quietly, without a bang, without any warning. Like a winter storm that coats everything in stillness before anyone even notices the air has changed. This is not the kind of revenge people cheer for in movies or talk about in dramatic therapy sessions. It's the kind of revenge that exists in the space where conversations used to live, in the unanswered text messages, in the voicemail inbox that never gets checked, in the seat left empty at a holiday table because someone finally decided that their absence was the only language the other person might begin to understand. I didn't plan to disappear, not at first, not in a deliberate or spiteful way. I didn't sit down with a checklist and mark off every family function I would now be boycotting. It started, like so many things do, with a silence that felt safer than honesty, and once I realized how quiet it had become, I also realized I didn't miss the noise. After that last dinner, the one where my parents managed to reframe years of indifference and favoritism into a tidy little accusation of me being distant and ungrateful, I drove home with a strange, hollow calm sitting heavy in my chest. The kind that usually follows a decision you didn't fully make out loud, but somehow already knew you were going to keep. The road was dark, long, and familiar, but for once it didn't feel like a loop. It felt like an exit. I remember getting to my apartment, kicking off my shoes, sitting on the edge of the bed, and realizing that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't mentally preparing my response for the next family phone call. Wasn't rehearsing fake laughter or neutral tones or the kind of updates that would be seen as acceptable or positive enough to keep the peace. The peace, as it turns out, had always come at a cost I could no longer afford to pay. I started with small things. I muted the family group chat, then archived it. I didn't block anyone. I wasn't trying to punish them. I just didn't want their noise in my life for a while. Then I stopped replying to emails, the kind with subject lines like quick update that weren't really updates at all but long-winded monologues about Tyler's latest adventures, none of which ever included a question about how I was or what I was doing. When my father called, I let it ring. When my mother texted, "Call me when you can," I didn't. And when Tyler messaged me, completely out of the blue, with a vague, "Hey, everything good?" I read it and said nothing. Because what could I possibly say that wouldn't sound either performative or cruel? And if I was being honest, it felt good, too good, maybe, to just let it all hang in the air like a question no one was brave enough to ask. The messages kept coming, of course, because people like them don't notice the absence right away. They just assume you're busy, or moody, or going through something temporary. The shift only became real to them when I missed my mother's birthday for the first time in 35 years, followed by Thanksgiving, which had never been my favorite holiday, but which I had always attended out of some outdated sense of obligation. When that chair sat empty at the table, when the small talk had to adjust to the hole I left behind, when the pictures they posted on social media had to crop me out not because I looked bad, but because I wasn't there, that's when they noticed. That's when the silence finally became a sound. They started calling more, not with urgency but with that passive, whiny confusion people have when they know they've done something wrong but are too prideful to ask what it is. My father left a voicemail saying, "We're not sure what's going on with you, but we'd really appreciate it if you came around more. Your mother misses you." And then, as if proving the point, he added, "And Tyler's had a rough month. We could use the extra support." I remember listening to that message 3 times, not because it upset me, but because it was such a perfect summary of everything I'd lived through. My absence wasn't about me, wasn't about any concern for how I was doing, wasn't about recognizing any of the pain they had caused. It was about them, their feelings, their convenience, their need to have me back in orbit around a family I had finally stepped away from. The irony is, by the time they realized I was gone, I had already started building a life that didn't include them. I didn't make a grand statement about it, didn't post on social media about cutting off toxic relatives or reclaiming my peace. I just started living. I moved to a different city, not far, but far enough that surprise visits would be unlikely and inconvenient. I changed my number, not out of malice, but because the carrier I switched to had a promotion and, well, It just felt right to start fresh. I got married in a small ceremony that included friends I considered family and none of the people who shared my blood. When I walked down that aisle, when I looked into the eyes of the person who had spent years slowly helping me unlearn the damage my family had done, I didn't feel a pang of sadness for who wasn't there. I felt free. Of course, freedom comes at a price, too. There are moments that feel like echoes of the life I might have had if things had been different. Like when I see other women laughing with their mothers over brunch, or when someone casually mentions how their dad helped them fix a leaky faucet last weekend. Those are the soft reminders, the ones that don't bruise but still sting a little. And then there are the harder ones, like when my sister-in-law sent me a photo of Tyler holding his newborn daughter, smiling like he was the first man to ever become a father, as if life had handed him yet another role he hadn't earned but would be celebrated for anyway. I looked at that photo for a long time, trying to decide if I felt anything at all: jealousy, sadness, anger, but mostly what I felt was a kind of strange, resigned detachment, like watching a movie you've already seen and knowing exactly how it ends. And then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived. Handwritten. From my mother. The handwriting hadn't changed. It was still sharp, looping, overly dramatic in a way that had once seemed elegant to me as a child and now just felt forced. The return address was the same house I had grown up in, the same one that still held the ghosts of so many conversations that never happened. I sat with the envelope for hours before opening it, not out of fear, but because I knew deeply and completely that once I read whatever was inside, something in me would have to choose whether or not I was really done. And when I finally opened it, what I read was not what I expected. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a question. Why are you punishing us? And just like that, the silence didn't feel so quiet anymore. There's a strange kind of grief that shows up not when someone dies, but when you finally accept that someone you once loved, truly, deeply, and without question, is never going to become the person you needed them to be. It doesn't come with a funeral or sympathy cards or casseroles from neighbors. It arrives in quiet moments, unexpected and unwelcome, like a flicker of memory while brushing your teeth or the sound of a voice that once meant safety but now only echoes confusion and regret. That letter from my mother, written in her perfectly practiced cursive, each line trembling just enough to seem vulnerable without actually admitting fault, wasn't a confession, wasn't a cry for reconciliation. And certainly wasn't the apology I had long since stopped hoping for. It was, at best, a performance. At worst, it was a final manipulation disguised as affection, one last attempt to rope me back in without ever acknowledging the rope burns left behind. The letter opened with pleasantries, hollow and rehearsed. "I hope you're doing well," she wrote, as though we had merely drifted apart because of schedules or distance, not because she had spent decades teaching me that my worth was directly tied to my compliance and my ability to stay silent when it mattered most. She went on to say that the holidays weren't the same without you, and that Tyler had been asking about you, which I didn't believe for a second, not because it wasn't possible, but because if he had truly cared, his voice would have found its way to me long before hers did. What stood out, however, more than any of the soft attempts at reconnection, was the center of the letter, the beating heart of her message, delivered in one perfectly weaponized sentence: "We don't understand why you're punishing us." It was written plainly, without flourish, a question that masqueraded as bewilderment, but was actually just an accusation wearing the mask of innocence. And for a moment, as I sat on my couch with the letter in my lap and the sun pouring in through the blinds like some cruel spotlight, I felt the old reflex kick in, the urge to explain myself, to justify the silence, to prove that I wasn't cruel, that I wasn't selfish, that I wasn't the cold, ungrateful daughter they had decided I was when I stopped playing the role they had written for me. But the truth, the real truth, is that I wasn't punishing them, I was protecting myself. I had spent most of my life contorting my emotions into palatable shapes so they wouldn't feel guilty, shrinking my needs to fit inside the narrow expectations of a family that only showed affection when it was convenient or performative. Walking away wasn't revenge. It was a rescue mission. And I was the one being rescued. Near the end of the letter, tucked between vague expressions of concern and reminders of my childhood, as though nostalgia could wipe away history, was a folded photograph. A glossy, full-color print, carefully placed inside the envelope, not with malice, but with the kind of obliviousness that can only come from people who have never once stopped to consider that their actions might be viewed through a lens other than their own. The photo showed my parents and Tyler sitting together at what looked like a beachside restaurant, fancy cocktails, tan skin, bright white smiles. My mother's hand rested lightly on Tyler's shoulder, my father held a glass of champagne, and Tyler was mid-laugh, eyes squinted in the golden glow of sunset. The timestamp on the back confirmed what I already suspected. The photo had been taken less than 2 months after I had stopped responding to their messages, during a time when, according to my mother's letter, they were sick with worry and constantly thinking of me. That was the moment something inside me clicked, not with rage, but with clarity, the kind that doesn't shout but simply settles into your bones like truth. They weren't grieving my absence. They were inconvenienced by it. They didn't want me back because they missed who I was. They wanted me back because my absence threatened the fragile illusion they had built, that we were a family, that nothing was wrong, that love had always flowed equally and without conditions. That photo didn't hurt me. It freed me. It reminded me that life had gone on for them, joyfully, easily, without interruption. And if they could live that way, then so could I. Still, part of me hesitated. Not out of regret, but out of some deeply buried instinct, the one children of emotional neglect never quite shake, the belief that maybe, just maybe, if I explained myself clearly enough, they would finally see what they'd been blind to for so long. So I picked up my phone, thumbed through old voicemails, and hovered over my mother's contact. I recorded a voice message, not scripted, just raw and immediate. I spoke about the years I had spent silencing myself to avoid being called difficult. I spoke about the panic attacks in high school, the nights I cried alone in college, the therapy I paid for out of pocket while they handed Tyler money like it grew on trees. I told her about the photo and what it revealed to me, not her intention, but her complete lack of awareness. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for understanding. I just told the truth, without apology. And then I sat there, phone in hand, staring at the screen. I didn't send it. Because in that moment, I realized the message wasn't for her. It never had been. It was for me. It was the confirmation that I no longer needed her to hear me in order to validate the voice I had spent a lifetime learning to trust. I deleted the recording. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I finally understood that I had already said everything I needed to say by walking away in the first place. Maybe one day they'll understand that silence, too, is a kind of language. Maybe they'll look back and realize that my distance wasn't punishment, it was peace. But whether they do or don't, it no longer matters. Because I am not the girl in their stories anymore, not the supporting character in the myth of our perfect family. I am not a footnote in Tyler's glowing narrative or a cautionary tale told over wine at dinner parties. I am the author now. And the story I'm writing doesn't need their approval. It only needs my truth. And that, finally, is enough.